The infinite horizon, the Dan Briggs paradox. Dan Briggs had always found comfort in the hum of machines. As a child, he'd sleep better with the dishwasher running in the kitchen or the air conditioner rattling against a summer window. It wasn't the noise itself, it was the rhythm, the promise of something working, something purposeful. As he stood now in the control room of the world's most powerful scientific instrument, the Large Hadron Collider, that familiar hum surrounded him, deeper and more complex than anything he had ever known. It was the heartbeat of a machine 17 miles wide. The LHC was not merely a ring buried beneath the border of France and Switzerland, it was a gateway to the smallest scales of existence. Dan gazed at the screens in front of him, each one overflowing with streams of data, temperature readings, magnetic field strengths, and particle counts. To most people, it was incomprehensible chaos. To Dan, it was a symphony. The collider worked by accelerating subatomic particles, usually protons, to nearly the speed of light using a system of superconducting magnets chilled to just above absolute zero. Dan had once described it to a visiting student as a racetrack for the smallest things that exist. But in truth, it was far more elegant. A series of radio frequency cavities pushed the protons faster and faster, while more than 1,000 magnets curved their paths around the immense ring. Two beams, racing in opposite directions, would finally meet at one of several detectors where the real spectacle occurred. Dan leaned closer to a monitor showing the vacuum integrity of beam line 2. The vacuum inside those pipes was more perfect than the natural vacuum of outer space, no stray particles to interfere, no air, no dust, not even a single molecule per cubic centimeter if everything was functioning correctly. The quietest place on Earth, he once joked to a colleague. A place where even atoms feel lonely. When the proton beams collided, they released bursts of pure energy, recreating conditions similar to those that existed a fraction of a second after the Big Bang. That was what always fascinated Dan. The idea that humanity had built a machine capable of peeling back time, not metaphorically, but literally, by smashing matter so hard it forgot what it once was. He moved to the glass window overlooking the main detector hall. Though he couldn't see the actual collisions, they happened deep within layers of shielding. He felt the significance through the vibrations in the floor, subtle and steady. Beneath his feet, in the heart of the underground cavern, detectors stacked like metallic matryoshka dolls were waiting to capture the aftershocks of creation, jets of quarks, sprays of photons, traces of particles that lived for mere trillionths of a second before vanishing forever. Dan had joined CERN as a senior systems engineer, but over time he had become more than that. He was a guardian of the collider, someone who understood both its fragile complexity and its enormous ambition. And he loved it for precisely those reasons. The LHC wasn't just a machine, it was humanity's way of asking the universe its hardest questions. The rest of the world might know the collider for its headlines and controversies, the machine that could unlock the secrets of the universe, the project that could create black holes, the discovery engine that found the Higgs boson. Dan knew it as a place of work, a place where he arrived with coffee and left with a mind full of cosmic possibilities. But lately, there had been anomalies. At first, they were small. Slight deviations in beam stability. Irregular magnetic flux readings that didn't match any known pattern. Brief, unexplained fluctuations in the cryogenic system. Nothing catastrophic, just enough to catch Dan's attention. Enough to keep him awake at night replaying diagnostic logs. He didn't know it yet, but these anomalies were the first signs of something extraordinary. something the collider had never shown before. Something the universe had not meant for them to find. And as Dan Briggs reviewed the morning's beam alignment results, he felt it again, a faint unease, like a shadow passing behind him. The collider was humming, but it didn't sound entirely like itself today. The public scrutiny began as a whisper, the kind that spreads quietly in online forums and late-night talk shows. But within days, it had grown into something louder and more insistent, a rising tide of concern that refused to be ignored. At first, Dan Briggs dismissed it as the usual background noise. Every major experiment the Large Hadron Collider prepared to run brought a new wave of speculation, fears of mini black holes, strange matter, vacuum instability, portals to other dimensions. The scientific community knew these things were impossible, at least at the energy levels the collider could produce. But fear didn't care about math. Then came the headlines. CERN to perform highest energy test in human history. Whistleblower claims LHC data being withheld. Leaked graphs suggest impossible readings. Dan's inbox filled with urgent messages from administrators, media coordinators, and government liaisons. By midweek, he found himself sitting in a brightly lit studio in Geneva, a microphone clipped to his jacket, the world watching as a news anchor leaned forward with a practiced expression of concern. "Dr. Briggs," she said, "millions of people online are saying the experiment planned this Friday could be dangerous. Some fear the collider is reaching energy levels never intended by its design. What can you say to reassure the public?" Dan smiled politely. Cameras were never his favorite part of the job, but he had become the unofficial spokesperson simply because he explained things well, and because he was good at sounding calm even when he wasn't. "With all due respect," he began, hands folded neatly on the desk, "the Large Hadron Collider is one of the most closely monitored scientific instruments on the planet. Every magnet, every sensor, every beamline is under constant supervision. Nothing happens without dozens of safety checks." The anchor nodded. "But what about claims that the collider's next run could produce phenomena we've never seen before?" "That's the purpose of science," Dan replied smoothly. "To observe things we've never seen before." "But dangerous phenomena?" "No. Not at these energy levels. The universe produces far more energetic collisions every second when cosmic rays strike the atmosphere. If the universe hasn't torn itself apart, neither will we." The audience watching at home saw confidence, assurance, stability. What they didn't see was the thin edge of doubt buried behind Dan's eyes. Because 2 hours before the interview, he had been in the control room staring at a set of numbers that froze him mid-sip of his coffee. Beamline 2's projected luminosity for the Friday test was higher than expected, significantly higher. The calculated energy density at collision time should have been well within predicted margins. Instead, the simulation produced an anomalous spike, like a mathematical hiccup. It wasn't impossible, but it wasn't supposed to happen. Dan had run the numbers 3 times himself. Not a computation error. Not a glitch. Something about the collider's internal conditions, magnetic alignment, vacuum purity, or perhaps something deeper, was causing the proton beams to behave more coherently than they should. Less scattering. More focus. The kind of unnatural precision that made the theoretical physicists whisper words like constructive confinement and unknown harmonics in the magnetic lattice. Even he had raised an eyebrow. And that was before he noticed the pattern. The spike wasn't random. It followed a rhythm. A repeating interval buried in the data, subtle enough that most analysts wouldn't have seen it. But Dan did. "Thank you, Dr. Briggs," the anchor said, smiling as the segment wrapped. "We appreciate your clarity." "My pleasure," Dan replied, the lights dimming as the broadcast ended. The director waved, assistants unclipped equipment, and within minutes Dan was back in the hallway outside the studio. The calm expression faded the moment no one was watching. He pulled out his phone and reopened the simulation results he'd saved earlier. The screen glowed softly as he scrolled through the anomaly. There it was again, those repeating intervals. They looked disturbingly like a signal. Not noise. Not error. Not coincidence. A pattern emerging from inside the collider itself. Dan swallowed hard. Whatever he had just told the world. He wasn't entirely sure he believed it anymore. The room was silent except for the soft clicking of keyboards. Dan Briggs stood at the center of the control chamber, surrounded by physicists, engineers, and analysts, each one staring at the same cluster of data displayed on the central monitor. Even the ever-present hum of the collider seemed muted, as if the machine itself were holding its breath. "It can't be that," muttered Dr. Lena Vasquez, CERN's leading theoretical physicist. She pushed her glasses up the bridge of her nose, eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and dread. "Not stable. Not at this scale. Not real." But the numbers insisted otherwise. Dan rubbed his jaw, staring at the containment readouts. "Run it again." "We've run it 12 times, Lena said. Same result. Same signatures. Same gravitational perturbation." A gravitational anomaly had appeared during the Friday experiment, small, microscopic, exactly what the collider's most speculative models predicted might occur when protons smashed together with unimaginable force. CERN had always known that tiny, quantum-scale black holes were theoretically possible, but they were supposed to last for trillionths of a second before evaporating instantly through Hawking radiation. This one had lasted 48 hours. And counting. Dan stared at the visualization, a shimmering point of distortion, invisible to human eyes but tracked by sensitive gravitational sensors embedded around the ring. The particle detectors had recorded the exact moment of formation, a spike of energy, a burst of quarks and gluons, and then, a gravitational dent, like a fingerprint pressed into the fabric of space-time. Maybe the decay sensors malfunctioned, someone suggested half-heartedly. "They didn't," Lena replied without looking away. "We're measuring mass. Mass doesn't lie." The black hole wasn't just persisting. It was growing. Dan's skin prickled. A chill crawled up his spine, one that had nothing to do with the cryogenic systems humming below. "How large?" he asked quietly. Lena swallowed. "Still microscopic. Nowhere near dangerous. It's smaller than a proton. Yet it's accumulated mass," Dan said. "From where?" "From the vacuum fluctuations," she replied. "It must be interacting with quantum fields more efficiently than theory predicts. Something's stabilizing it." Dan looked at her sharply. "Something internal." She shook her head. "Or something external." The words hung in the room like a dropped weight. He turned to the gravitational graph showing the anomaly's growth over time. The curve was smooth, steady, unmistakable. It increased by nanograms, infinitesimal amounts, but measurable. Predictable. Deliberate. Black holes didn't behave deliberately. Could it rupture the beamline? An engineer asked, voice shaking. No, Lena said quickly. It's far too small. Even growing, it would take centuries to pose a threat. But, Dan said, finishing the thought no one wanted to voice, it shouldn't exist for more than a fraction of a second. And yet here we are. The room fell still again. Dan stepped closer to the monitor, staring into the glowing red dot representing the anomaly. Rationally, he knew he wasn't looking at the black hole itself, it was beyond sight, beyond comprehension. But something about the data felt wrong. Off. Familiar in a way he couldn't articulate. Has it emitted anything unusual? He asked. No radiation, no jets, no Hawking signature, Lena replied. It's completely silent. Silent. Growing. Stable. Nature didn't do stable black holes at this scale. Unless something wanted it to be stable. Dan turned, feeling the weight of hundreds of meters of machinery pressing down from all directions. The collider had opened doors into realms of physics never seen before, but it wasn't supposed to open this door. How long until the next growth checkpoint? He asked. 3 hours, Lena said. Dan nodded grimly. We monitor it constantly. Notify me if the mass increases even a nanogram. People began moving again, shaken but purposeful. Data streamed across the monitors. The collider hummed. The anomaly sat at the edge of existence, a micro-tear in reality refusing to close. Dan lingered, staring one last time at the gravitational map. If black holes were supposed to evaporate but this one refused, then something fundamental was broken. Or something new had begun. And beneath the fear tightening his chest, one dreadful realization formed, quiet and cold. Whatever they had created, it might not be theirs anymore. The first sign that the situation had spiraled beyond CERN's control was the convoy. Dan Briggs stood at the main entrance to the underground facility as 4 black SUVs rolled silently to a stop. Their engines idled with a low, predatory hum. Doors opened in perfect choreography, and a team of men and women stepped out, uniformed in charcoal suits, badges tucked just barely out of sight, expressions hard as obsidian. The lead agent extended a hand. Mr. Briggs. I'm Director Mason Hale, European Security Coalition. His tone was polite but cold, the kind used only when someone already knows more than they are letting on. We're here for a full assessment of your anomaly. Dan forced a neutral smile. CERN is cooperating fully. We'll bring you to the control room. Hale nodded, then gestured for his team to follow. They moved with uncanny synchronicity, too coordinated to be mere bureaucrats. These were people accustomed to black-budget projects, classified disasters, and situations that required plausible deniability. As they approached the elevator descending to the collider ring, Agent Hale paused, his gaze fixed on the reinforced doors. How close are we to the event? He asked. Dan hesitated, choosing his words carefully. About 300 meters from the nearest wall of the main experimental cavern. And containment is stable. Dan didn't answer. That was enough of an answer. Inside the control room, the agents spread out through the chamber like wolves entering unfamiliar territory. Screens flickered with updated gravitational readings. Analysts whispered urgently. Stress etched itself into every creased forehead. Hale stepped up beside Lena Vasquez, who stood frozen before the anomaly's mass graph. "Doctor," Hale said quietly, "explain this." "Plain English." Lena's voice was paper-thin. "It's growing. Slowly, but undeniably. And its gravity is strengthening. We're seeing microlensing effects. Nothing catastrophic yet, but... Hale pressed. Dan answered for her. "But we don't know when it will stop." The room fell silent. And then... thud. A deep, resonant vibration rolled through the floor. The lights flickered once, like a warning blink. "What was that?" an agent barked, hand drifting toward a holstered weapon as if he expected something alive to crawl out of the walls. Lena stared at the seismic readout. Structural flux. The anomaly's gravity is starting to interact with the cavern walls. Dan's throat tightened. "That shouldn't be possible at this scale." "None of this should be possible," Lena whispered. Descent into chaos. They were halfway down the maintenance corridor leading to the experimental cavern when the next sound came. Creak. Metal stressed. Concrete groaned. Somewhere ahead, a distant crack echoed like a rifle shot. The agents froze instantly. Another sound followed. Clink, clink, clink. Small bolts and washers, shaken loose from the ceiling conduit, fell to the floor and rolled toward the far end of the hall. Rolled toward something. Drawn. Hale's voice dropped to a whisper. "Is that gravitational pull?" Dan nodded once. And then a far more terrifying noise erupted. Crack. The corridor wall nearest the black hole bowed inward, only by a few millimeters, but visibly. Dust drifted down in a quiet gray cloud. "Everyone back!" Dan shouted. But chaos had already begun. In the control room above, alarms triggered one after another, structural warnings, proximity alerts, gravitational threshold notices. Emergency lights bathed the hallway in pulsing red. Radio chatter exploded. Unidentified collapse near Sector C. Sensors malfunctioning, no, being pulled. "We need to evacuate now." The black hole, still microscopic but growing, was starting to consume tiny things. Dust. Loose metal. Microfragments of concrete. But each thing it swallowed increased its mass, which increased its gravity, which allowed it to swallow more. Evacuation. Dan turned to Hale. "We need to clear the entire facility. Now." Hale didn't argue. "All personnel, evacuate immediately." "That's an order." The hallway erupted into action, agents securing paths, scientists grabbing critical drives, technicians sprinting toward stairwells. Sirens wailed overhead, a deep, mournful sound Dan had only heard once during a catastrophic cryogenic failure years before. He grabbed Lena's wrist. "We have to go." But she wasn't looking at him. She was staring at the floor as a small screw vibrated, shivered, and then abruptly slid across the concrete, accelerating toward the cavern ahead. More debris followed. Then Dan felt it, a tug in his gut, subtle but real. Gravity. Artificial gravity. Pulling. growing, hungry. "We need to seal the cavern," Hale shouted. "Blow the emergency barriers if we must." Another crack echoed, deeper, louder. Concrete fractured somewhere close. Dan didn't want to imagine what was happening inside the cavern itself. If the anomaly had begun feeding, even at microscopic scales, they might be beyond protocols. Beyond containment. Beyond anything humans were prepared to confront. He shoved Lena toward the stairs as dust rained from the ceiling. The world seemed to tilt. The collider's hum grew louder. And behind them, deep in the darkness of the experimental cavern, something small, silent, and impossibly dense kept growing. Within 12 hours, the collider complex had transformed from a world-class scientific facility into a militarized construction zone. Helicopters thundered overhead. Concrete mixers, steel haulers, and cranes swarmed the outskirts like mechanical insects. Floodlights turned night into harsh, artificial day. Armed personnel ringed the perimeter. And at the center of it all, buried deep beneath the earth, was the anomaly, growing quietly, invisibly, patiently. Dan Briggs stood beside Director Hale as they watched an armored convoy deliver another truckload of shimmering plates, titanium lattice composites fused with industrial diamond, some of the hardest materials ever engineered. The government was done trying to understand the anomaly. It was time to contain it. "We're calling it the Aegis structure," Hale said, shouting over the roar of generators. 3 concentric shells, each a meter thick. Titanium diamond first, tungsten carbide second, reinforced carbon fiber third. "Nothing on Earth is stronger." "It won't matter," Dan murmured. Hale didn't react. Maybe he didn't hear. Maybe he did and chose not to. Either way, the operation pressed on with feverish urgency. The race against gravity. Inside the cavern, robotic cranes rushed overhead, maneuvering massive plates into position. Thousands of workers, engineers, and soldiers moved like a frantic army. Sparks flew from welding torches. Hydraulic clamps slammed metal into place. The deeper the crew went, the louder the groaning of the walls became. A sound like distant thunder rumbled through the earth. Dan stepped forward, watching in awe as the first containment shell slid into place. Each panel weighed several tons, yet several of them trembled, just slightly, as if tugged by a force on the other side of the ring. Lena ran up beside him, breathless. She held a tablet with the latest gravitational readings. "It's accelerating," she said. "How much?" Dan asked. "We're past microscale. It's now measuring at sub-millimeter mass concentration." Dan froze. "It's visible." "No," she said softly. "But it's large enough to distort sensors outside the cavern. And if it grows another order of magnitude, it will begin pulling matter directly through the chamber walls." Lena nodded. The black hole was no longer content with dust and loose particles. It wanted more. Aegis rises. For 2 days and 2 nights, work continued without pause. Sleep-deprived engineers stumbled between their stations. Soldiers carried materials until their arms trembled. Food was handed out in plastic packets. No one complained. This was no longer a scientific crisis. This was survival. 3 concentric shells soon surrounded the collider chamber, gleaming titanium diamond plating on the outside, dark tungsten in the middle, and matte carbon fiber bracing it all. Each layer sealed with industrial bolts the size of a man's forearm. It was a fortress, an unbelievable, last-resort fortress. As Dan watched the final plate being locked into place, Hale approached, his face drawn but triumphant. "There," he said. "Even gravity won't pull through that." Dan didn't answer. Instead, he looked down. Dust vibrated at their feet, trembling toward the sealed cavern door. A soft creak echoed. Hale's smile fell. The first bend. 15 minutes after Aegis was completed, alarms blared again. Gravitational lensing detected. Stress fractures forming. Outer shell integrity compromised. It's pulling the whole structure inward. Dan sprinted to the observation terminal, grabbing onto a metal rail as a low rumble shook the floor. On the monitor, readings spiked with terrifying sharpness. Aegis was bending. The titanium diamond plates, thicker than tank armor, were deforming inward by millimeters. But the curve was accelerating. "It shouldn't be this strong," Lena whispered, tears gathering in her eyes. "It's not possible. Not physically possible." Dan stared, breath caught in his throat. "Unless something is feeding it. Something we don't understand." On the cavern camera feed, dust whipped past the lens. Bolts snapped free like bullets. The innermost shell of the containment structure began to wrinkle, as if someone were pressing a giant thumb into aluminum foil. And then, crack! A section of the titanium wall buckled inward. The impossible had happened. One of the strongest man-made materials ever produced had just crumpled like cheap tin. The room erupted into shouting. Workers fled down the tunnels. Welders dropped their tools and ran. Soldiers pulled evac crews back, herding them toward safety. Another groan reverberated through the earth. The second shell began to deform. Then the third. The black hole was tearing through them, drawing in thousands of tons of engineered material as if gravity itself had become hungry. Dan felt the pull now, a faint dragging sensation, like his body wanted to lean toward the cavern. He grabbed Lena's wrist. "We need to go." Director Hale shouted orders into his radio, voice nearly drowned by the screaming metal. "Aegis is lost. Repeat, Aegis is compromised. Full evacuation, now." The containment walls bowed further. Panels ripped free. Support beams screamed. And deep beneath the earth, unseen but felt by every trembling atom around it, the black hole continued to grow. The evacuation alarm echoed through the underground structure like a mechanical scream. Lights strobed red along the ceiling, pulsing in irregular intervals as power fluctuations rippled through the grid. Dan Briggs shoved through a crowd of fleeing workers, guiding Lena toward the freight lift as the walls around them groaned like something alive. The black hole was no longer a theoretical aberration hidden deep behind reinforced doors. It was influencing everything. Above them, the earth trembled as if reacting to an unseen tide pulling upward from below, breaching the surface. When the lift doors clanged open at ground level, the scene outside was no longer the frantic construction site of the day prior. It had shifted into something far more chaotic, and far more terrified. The horizon wavered. Distant trees bent subtly inward, leaning toward the collider grounds even though no wind blew. Dust and dry leaves drifted across the gravel as if magnetized. Flocks of birds looped in confused spirals overhead, unable to maintain steady flight paths. Director Hale barked into his radio as he surveyed the scene. Sector G is reporting gravitational shear, repeat, shear at the surface level. Evacuate all personnel within a 5-kilometer radius. Dan stared at the faint shimmer in the distance where the ground seemed to slightly dip. Not a crater, not yet, but a distortion. Reality pulling inward, the Earth beginning to sag toward the anomaly below. He swallowed hard. It's affecting the terrain. Lena shook her head, voice cracking. It shouldn't be large enough to do that. None of this should be possible without mass far beyond. But she didn't finish. Because deep down, even she no longer trusted the limits of known physics. Ripple effects. Dan jogged toward a line of military vans being loaded with equipment. As he passed a parked truck, he noticed the steel toolbox in the back bed rattling, then sliding. Slowly at first, then faster. It clanged against the tailgate. Then lifted. The toolbox rose an inch, 2 inches, hovering just slightly above the bed before snapping back down as gravity fluctuated again. Nearby soldiers stepped back, hands tightening on their rifles even though bullets would do nothing against what was happening. A young private stared at Dan with wide eyes. "Sir, why is gravity moving?" Dan had no answer. But the truth was written across every warped surface, every shifting shadow, every object trembling toward the collider's buried ring. The black hole wasn't just growing. It was breathing, expanding and collapsing in microscopic pulses as it fed. The government's desperation. Mobile command centers sprouted like armored mushrooms along the perimeter. Satellite trucks pointed dishes skyward. Uniformed officials shouted into encrypted radios. The air crackled with panic masked by procedure. Dan and Lena were escorted to the main command tent, a rigid composite structure reinforced to withstand explosions. Inside, a massive holographic display projected the collider tunnel. A glowing red sphere marked the expanding anomaly. It was larger now. Significantly larger. Hale slammed a fist against the table. "We need contingency options. We need them now." A general stepped forward. "We've considered kinetic suppression, a high-pressure implosion using bunker-buster delivery systems." Lena stared at him as though he'd lost his mind. "You can't bomb a black hole. Technically, we'd be collapsing the surrounding substrate." Dan held up a hand sharply. "No. You'd be feeding it mass. Everything you destroy becomes fuel. The more you throw at it, the faster it grows." Murmurs fluttered across the room. Another official spoke. "We have scientists from 3 nations saying the anomaly is behaving unlike any predicted model. Some believe." He hesitated. Hale glared. "Say it." "Some believe the black hole is being stabilized." Dan felt the temperature in the tent drop. "By what?" "We don't know." Lena exhaled shakily. "It's not stabilizing itself. Something is preventing Hawking decay. Something is feeding its cohesion. Something wants it alive." The room went still. Surface collapse begins. A sudden tremor shook the command tent, strong enough to rattle equipment and knock papers from the tables. The holographic display flickered. Then a voice crackled over comms. Partial surface subsidence detected. Ground is buckling above the collider. We've lost 3 monitoring stations. Repeat, the Earth is collapsing inward. Dan shoved past Hale and burst from the tent. Outside, dirt and dust swirled in an unnatural spiral. A section of ground a quarter-mile away sagged downward by nearly a foot, forming a shallow bowl, all pulling toward the anomaly below. Workers screamed and scattered as vehicles slid slowly across the ground. One abandoned forklift began skidding sideways, scraping across asphalt until it tipped over and crashed on its side with a metallic shriek. The gravitational tide had reached the surface. And it was growing stronger. A moment of realization. Dan felt the faint tug on his own body now, like leaning downhill, except the slope wasn't physical. He grabbed Lena's hand to keep her steady. Her eyes were wet, not with panic, but with the crushing realization of what they were facing. "It's too late," she whispered. "Containment won't work. Evacuation won't work. Nothing we build can keep up with exponential mass accumulation." Dan looked toward the trembling horizon. "We need a new plan," he said quietly. "Something beyond containment." Lena nodded. Hale strode up behind them, his voice low. "Then heaven help us," he said, "because the next step may not be survivable." And as they watched the ground continue to sag and twist under the invisible force below, Dan Briggs understood something chilling. The black hole wasn't just growing. It was trying to escape. News traveled faster than any government could control. At first, satellite images leaked online, blurry shots posted anonymously on message boards. Then national space agencies confirmed them. And finally, live feeds began broadcasting across the globe. Every screen on Earth showed the same impossible sight. A darkened pit, widening slowly but steadily in the heart of Europe. A depression so vast it warped the clouds above it. A crater that hadn't been made by impact, but by collapse. The Earth was sinking inward. And everyone knew why. The world tries to run. Highways jammed instantly. Cars clogged every exit from Switzerland, France, Italy, Germany. Helicopters thundered overhead, ferrying diplomats who knew evacuation was a formality, not salvation. Sirens wailed across major cities. Borders dissolved as fear overtook bureaucracy. Dan Briggs watched emergency broadcasts play across the monitors in the command tent. Families strapped mattresses to car roofs. People sprinted through train stations. Airports overflowed with crowds desperate to board anything that still had fuel. Mothers held their children close, whispering comfort they didn't believe. People screamed, prayed, cursed, begged. But there was nowhere to go. The anomaly wasn't merely a hole in the ground. It was a wound in space-time, and it was widening. The satellite view. General Roux stepped inside the tent looking pale and defeated. "The latest satellite pass is coming through." Everyone gathered around the central screen. The image refreshed, and the room went silent. The collapse zone was now visible from orbit as a broad, bowl-shaped distortion miles across. Soil, stone, and bedrock curved inward toward the epicenter. Roads bent. Rivers shifted course. Buildings at the periphery leaned visibly toward the center, their foundations slipping. The land was folding like soft clay. And the satellite captured something else. A faint shimmer. A swirling distortion at the dead center. Not quite visible, but unmistakable. The black hole was growing. Not fast enough to swallow the planet in seconds, but fast enough to make the outcome certain. Dan felt his stomach drop as the satellite image zoomed out. The depression resembled a slow, inexorable whirlpool. Earth itself was being drawn inward. Acceptance. The first global broadcasts of calm voices began around dusk. Not politicians, many had already gone silent. Not military leaders. Not scientists. Just ordinary people. A father holding his two daughters as they sat on the floor of their living room, smiling through tears. It's okay. We're together. That's what matters. A woman on a rooftop in New York, speaking into her phone as the sunset glowed red. I'm at peace. Truly. To my mom, I'll see you soon. An elderly couple sitting on a bench in Tokyo, holding hands. A street musician in Brazil playing the guitar softly as crowds gathered around him. A priest in Nigeria praying for the world, surrounded by hundreds in silent vigil. Humanity, in its final hours, remembered how to be human. The realization of finality. Lena stood beside Dan in the tent entrance, watching the sky glow with the strange twilight of dust rising from miles away. It's happening faster, she whispered. Look at the horizon. The line of trees in the distance sagged. Power lines dipped. The ground itself crawled toward the pit like liquid under a tilted table. People outside the command perimeter stopped running. Many just collapsed to their knees. Others stood frozen, staring. Some held one another tightly, whispering apologies, forgiveness, or final goodbyes. Dan saw a soldier lower his rifle and sink to the dirt, pulling out a photograph of his wife. He saw a scientist embrace her colleague, sobbing but smiling. He saw Director Hale staring blankly at the sinking Earth, all authority gone from his features. You said we needed a plan, Hale murmured. Dan nodded, his throat tight. We did. But now it's too late. Dan couldn't lie. Yes. A planet in mourning. Across the globe, people watched the live feeds as the depression widened. News anchors cried openly on camera. Entire cities gathered in plazas for the last time. Some families lit candles. Others sang hymns or lullabies. Billions of people held tight to the ones they loved, refusing to face the end alone. In the command tent, the tremors grew stronger. The lights flickered. Earth groaned. And Dan Briggs understood, with crushing certainty. Humanity was experiencing its final sunset. But in that moment, with the world collapsing, with fear and love woven together into the same breath, Earth felt united in a way it never had before. Not in survival, but in acceptance. Dan Briggs drove until the roads cracked behind him. The highways had split open like seams. Trees leaned inward, pulled gently toward the collapsing Earth. Abandoned cars lined the ditches. In the distance, sirens howled for no one. And behind it all, beneath the growl of the engine and the wheeze of dying power lines, Dan could hear it. A low, endless rumble. The sound of a planet folding in on itself. By dusk, he reached the cabin. His cabin. The one place untouched by years of data, equations, and machinery. A small wooden refuge nestled between pine and birch, built by his grandfather long before particle colliders existed. He stepped out of the car, every motion slow and heavy. The world was dim, not from nightfall, but from the dust rising across continents. The sky was bruised with swirling reds and grays. Ash drifted like snow. The ground trembled under his boots. Dan's legs finally gave up. He dropped to his knees in the dry leaves. The weight of guilt. The cabin's porch creaked as he sat against its railing, staring at the warped horizon. The depression miles away had grown into a chasm, a spiraling basin eating the crust, growing with each breath. He had told the world the collider was safe. He had gone on TV and smiled. He had reassured billions. And now the Earth itself was unraveling. Lena's voice echoed in his memory, something wanted it alive. But it didn't matter anymore. No explanation could soften the truth. Dan had helped create the conditions. He had opened the door. Now humanity would pay the price. He pressed his palms to his face and sobbed until he couldn't breathe. The sound was swallowed instantly by the deep, constant roar of global collapse. The end draws closer. Night fell, though the sky never turned dark. It glowed faintly, lit from below by the molten churn of a dying mantle. Dan retreated inside the cabin. The old wooden walls groaned. Dust sifted from the rafters with every seismic shudder. He sat in his grandfather's rocking chair, the seat he used to curl into as a child. He remembered reading science books here, dreaming of unlocking the universe. Now the universe was unlocking him. A loud crack split the air outside. The earth lurched, throwing him forward. Plates fell from shelves. The window shattered inward from pressure differentials he could feel in his bones. Outside, trees toppled in slow motion, tilting toward the abyss, roots snapping like brittle twigs. Dan stepped back onto the porch. The air was thin now, pulled subtly toward the vacuum forming miles away. Leaves spiraled past him. A gust of wind tugged at his shirt, then his hair, then his breath. He could see the final collapse approaching. The land no longer sloped gently. It curved inward. A vast funnel swallowing mountains. His cabin sat on what had once been high ground. Now it hung at the edge of a sinking world. Surrender. Dan closed his eyes. I'm sorry, he whispered to no one and everyone. I'm so sorry. Another tremor knocked him to one knee. He clung to the railing as the porch board snapped beneath his hands. Then the wind stopped. All sound vanished, replaced by a single, deep, resonant vibration passing through the air like a heartbeat. The pressure shifted. His body grew lighter, then heavier, then weightless. Leaves, pebbles, splinters of wood. All rose gently into the air, floating like motes of dust. Dan lifted too. For a moment, he hung suspended above the collapsing forest, weightless in the grip of inevitability. Beneath him, the world contorted into a spiraling descent of earth and fire. He took one last breath. And gravity claimed him. His body stretched, pulled, and finally dissolved as he was drawn into the abyss. Into the silent, infinite nothing. Into the heart of the black hole he helped create. The cabin vanished an instant later. Then the forest. Then the mountains. And Dan Briggs passed beyond space, beyond time. A final casualty of the collapse he never meant to unleash. The earth shuddered again, sinking deeper into the cosmic wound. And then the world was gone. Dan awoke to birdsong. Soft, melodic, impossibly gentle. He blinked, his vision swimming with early morning sunlight spilling through the window of his cabin. The same cabin whose boards had cracked and splintered in the gravitational collapse. The same cabin that had toppled into the abyss. He sat upright with a gasp. His chest rose and fell. Breath. Warmth. Life. The cabin was whole. The glass in the window unbroken. The rocking chair upright. The walls unmoving, untouched by the quake that had once consumed them. For a long moment he simply sat there, trembling, waiting for the nightmare to return, waiting to feel that terrible downward pull of gravity ripping the world apart. But the air was still. Calm. Beautiful. It was morning. Dan stumbled out onto the porch. Dew glittered on the grass. Birds hopped between branches. A soft breeze brushed against his face. The forest looked green and healthy, no broken trunks, no twisted roots, no sinking earth. "I survived," he whispered. Or perhaps something stranger had happened. A town almost familiar. His old car sat in the driveway. Its paint still chipped, its windows dusty. He slid into the driver's seat, heart racing as the engine coughed to life. The familiar vibration beneath him felt grounding, real. Human. He drove toward town, soaking in the ordinary scenery. Yet something gnawed at him. The sky seemed too blue. The trees too symmetrical. The air tasted faintly metallic, like ozone or static. As he crested the final hill, the small town of Vallée-Saint-Pierre came into view. But it wasn't quite Vallée-Saint-Pierre. Buildings stood where they always had, but their shapes were subtly wrong. Corners curved instead of right-angled. Roofs sloped in unfamiliar ways. The colors were muted, grays and soft greens rather than the rustic yellows and reds he remembered. Then he saw something even stranger. A herd of animals grazed in a nearby field, tall, slender creatures with elongated necks and shimmering fur that shifted colors as they moved. They were graceful, majestic, and unlike anything recorded in biology. Dan slammed on the brakes. What is this?" His hand shook as he stepped out of the car, staring at the creatures. They raised their heads, studying him with large, luminous eyes, calm, curious, alien. He stumbled backward into the driver's seat and sped into town. A new kind of people. When he reached Main Street, his heart nearly stopped. People walked along the sidewalks, but not people as he knew them. They were 10 to 12 feet tall, with elongated limbs and elegant posture. Their skin ranged from pale silver to deep slate blue, subtly reflective in the sun. Their eyes were large, bright, almost crystalline. Their clothing was simple, draped and smooth like woven glass. They noticed him instantly. A few stopped mid-step, tilting their heads with a slow, deliberate motion. Others whispered to one another, soft tones that harmonized like wind chimes. Dan's pulse hammered in his ears. "What happened to humanity?" he whispered. One of the tall beings took a cautious step toward him, raising a hand in greeting. Its face held no hostility, only curiosity. Dan backed away, panic engulfing him. He turned and ran. Where the lab should be. He sprinted the 3 blocks to where CERN's Auxiliary Research Annex once stood. A modest 2-story building with reinforced foundations, it had always been Dan's home away from home. But when he arrived, it wasn't there. The entire plot of land was empty. Not a ruin, not rubble, just a smooth, grassy clearing, as if no structure had ever been built. No broken glass. No steel beams. No concrete remains. Nothing. Dan fell to his knees, chest heaving. "It's gone," he whispered. "All of it. Everything I knew." He pressed his palms to the soil. It was warm. Vibrant. Alive. A slow realization began to form, one so terrifying and profound that he shook with it. He had not survived the black hole. The Earth had not survived the black hole. It had been transported. Not destroyed, but translocated. Shifted. Spat out somewhere else. Somewhere with different physics. Different life. Different inhabitants. A different dimension. Dan looked up at the sky, at birds with 6 wings, at clouds shaped like spirals rather than tufts. "This isn't home," he whispered. Footsteps approached behind him, slow, heavy, deliberate. He turned. One of the tall beings stood only a few feet away, gazing down at him with a calm, curious expression. Its voice, when it spoke, was melodic and layered, like 2 tones resonating together. "Wanderer," it said in perfect English, "you are far from where you began." Dan's hands trembled. "What are you? What is this place?" The being knelt to his level, its crystalline eyes shimmering softly. "This," it said, "is where your world was brought. And you must now discover why." Dan felt the weight of its words settle deep into his bones. He was no longer a man in a dying world. He was a stranger in a new universe. One he would have to uncover piece by piece. Alone at first. But perhaps not for long. Dan drove back to the cabin in a daze, hands shaking on the wheel. The roads looked familiar, the trees familiar, but now everything felt like an imitation. A reflection of Earth rendered by something that had only glimpsed the real thing. When he reached the cabin, he shut the door and leaned against it, chest heaving. His mind raced like an engine stuck at red line. A new dimension. A new Earth. Strange beings who spoke his language. A laboratory that never existed. A world rebuilt but wrong. He stumbled into the living room and dropped into the rocking chair, rubbing his hands across his face. "How do I even begin?" he whispered. "Where do I start?" He needed answers. He needed information. Anything. On instinct, he reached for the remote. The television flickered to life. Static. A high whining tone. Then an image sharpened into view. Dan froze. Because staring back at him was Dan Briggs. His own face. His own voice. His own calm expression. The broadcast showed a pristine newsroom. Behind the on-screen Dan was a banner. CERN prepares for high-energy run. Dr. Dan Briggs on safety concerns. Dan's breath caught in his throat. No, this can't be happening. The Dan on the TV smiled politely as the anchor asked, Dr. Briggs, many citizens are worried about the possibility of microscopic black holes forming during the upcoming experiment. What would you say to reassure them? Television Dan replied with the exact words Dan remembered speaking in his own world. There is no danger. Black holes, even if formed, would evaporate instantly. There is absolutely no risk to the public. Dan's stomach twisted. This world's collider hadn't collapsed yet. They were about to attempt the same experiment. He lurched forward, volume trembling as he raised it. And when will this test occur? The anchor asked. Tomorrow morning, the alternate Dan said. It will be the highest energy collision ever performed. The screen cut to footage of the familiar collider ring, gleaming, intact, humming with potential. Dan's heart pounded. His mouth went dry. A cold realization settled like lead in his chest. He wasn't just in another dimension. He was in another timeline. One where events had not yet unfolded. One where another Dan Briggs was still alive. Still confident. Still giving false reassurances. Still about to doom the world. Dan gripped the arms of the chair as the truth hit him like a collapsing star. This was not a safe haven. Not a restart. Not salvation. This was a cycle. A loop. A chain of realities all teetering on the edge of the same fatal experiment. The tall beings, the strange animals, the off-model architecture. None of it was an accident. Earth had not been saved by shifting dimensions. Earth had been moved through dimensions. Dragged like debris through cosmic layers. And now, watching himself assure billions that everything was fine, Dan understood. The anomaly didn't destroy worlds. It connected them. Like a tunnel. A corridor. A doorway without an end. He wasn't at the end of the journey. He was at the beginning of an infinite, spiraling descent. Dan stared at the screen, feeling nauseous. I can't stop this, he whispered. No matter where I go, it's happening again. The other Dan on the TV smiled confidently as the segment ended. And Dan Briggs realized he might be trapped in a multiversal maze. One black hole after another. One collapsing Earth after another. One doomed version of himself speaking the same reassurances. This was only the first step of an endless journey. And the only question now was, how many Earths were left before every version of Dan Briggs faced the same collapse? The end.